Esteemed Director, dear colleagues, friends and guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Ria Berg, the director of the Finnish Institute and our host tonight, for the honor of giving this Amos Anderson lecture of 2025. It was Berg's idea to dedicate this conference to grotesques, or grotesque, a decorative motif found in ancient and Renaissance mural and wall painting. These motifs, can I already use it? These motifs are especially abundant here at our venue, for example, in this room and in other rooms. Raphael's Villa Lante. As many of you may know, my research into mural and wall paintings of Nero's Golden House in Pompeii and other Roman sites has made me familiar with grotesque decorations in the ancient world. In this presentation, I will first trace the history of grotesques from their Renaissance rediscovery, and I will examine whether they truly constitute also an ancient artistic genre. Throughout the lecture, I will refer to discoveries and insights from studies to Roman wall paintings to shed light on the origin and significance of grotesques. And to do this, we not only have to look at Roman material, but also known to the Renaissance artists in Rome, but also at decorative works from other sites like Pompeii and Oplontis. The word grotesque, first of all, refers to the vaults and ceilings in the only preserved building pavilion of Nero's Golden House on the Oppius or Esquiline Hill, discovered in the late 15th century after an oblivion of 14 centuries, and nowadays accessible for the general public with well-instructed guides. Built in 4 years, but not completed at the time of Nero's suicide in the summer of 68, the building remained in use for some decades, as we can glean from the presence of repainted rooms and a couple of architectural interventions. At the latest, the construction of the Trajan bath, as you see at the right-hand side, and here on the plan, probably already started under Domitian, made it necessary to fill the rooms of the ground floor with debris in order to function as the platform of the new baths. This is how these rooms became grottos, in the perception of the people who discovered the place from above. They fell through to holes on the debris, as you see in the middle and on the right and the left. And this, of course, by chance. In his account of the pavilion's discovery by Giovanni da Udine, Giorgio Vasari immediately speaks about groteschine. We see the entrance of the Golden House pavilion on an enigmatic painting ascribed to the Dutch painter Hermanus Postumus of 1536. A man studies a column in front of a cavern. Maybe it's the painter himself. The canvas was made after his visit to the Golden House, together with another Dutch artist, Maarten van Heemskerk. Maarten van Heemskerk himself used grotesque motifs on a painting from the same year, 1536. The amorous couple Mars and Venus sits under a vault, whereas the Forge of Vulcan at the right is situated in a real cave. And Cupid approaches from the left and runs down a flight of stairs at the outside of the grottos. The word grotesque appears in a poem of an unknown Italian poet from Milan, that latter because of the dialect, who vividly describes the wonderworks that the people see creeping on top of the fill material. Just below the barely visible decorations, you see, they call them work of Cimabue, Apelles, and Giotto, you see it in the third line. The text was composed around 1500 and has been attributed to the architect Bramante. And here you see the text, and you see in the third stanza the word grotesque. So we andiam per terra con nostre venentesche, con pane, con prosciutto, pomme e vino, per essere più bizzarri alle grottesche. The character of the location, therefore, has been the cause that in the Renaissance the word has become a terminus technicus for fantastic ornaments, mixed human and animal creatures, as well as vegetal and abstract motifs, often composed in the shape of vegetal, tree-like constructions which can serve as vertical framings and adornments on walls or as parts of frameworks covering ceilings and vaults, just as we see here above our heads. They are ornamental and monstrous at a time, and therefore can be terrifying and amusing simultaneously. Grotesques, however, were by far more than ornaments only. As said by Chris Ascot Hammeken and Maria Fabritius Hansen in a new book, quote, "In this sense, early modern monstrous ornaments were manifestations of artists' abilities to transform ambiguities of perception into images that were inextricably linked with reflection upon artistic license," end quotation. It has become clear that during the Renaissance, artists discovered ancient paintings in other sites as well, just as the Colosseum and the Villa Hadriana in Tivoli, which led to a further documentation and evaluation of the Roman artistic products in modern painting. However, if I may say so from the perspective of an archaeologist, the documentary value of the designs, which you will see shortly, and sketches is less evident than one would like. As in the case of later 18th century documentation of the murals in Herculaneum and Pompeii, we rarely find complete walls. You see only the details. The details. You find the details, which we must admit is often an extremely difficult job to accomplish. Well, you are lying on top of the debris. You have to look and to draw at the same time in that awkward position. The ornaments and figural scenes were easier to copy and fulfilled the satisfaction, like you see the small parts, of the curious visitors of the monuments, much more than complete schemes as the drawing on the left-hand side from the 18th century. Marco Brunetti has made clear that this documentary flaw in his thorough study on the Volta Dorata. The Volta Dorata we will see more times. The ample documentation of the major room of the pavilion does only partly help us to reconstruct the original vault, maybe already heavily damaged at the time of discovery. The complexity of copying both the complete syntax and the details made it impossible to represent the vault as trustworthy as possible. If we look one more time at the paintings of 1536 by Van Heemskerk and Posthumus, we observe sets of arches corresponding with the vaults of rooms in the western section of the pavilion, where you now enter nowadays, decorated with monochrome yellow and red decorations of rooms appropriately called volta gialla and volta rossa. These decors are easily recognizable thanks to the lavish use of monochrome backgrounds in combination with a detailed ornamentation. The yellow room, for example, reappears in Van Heemskerk's small painting. The red room looks like the patches on Posthumus' canvas, although most scholars believe that this room was not yet discovered in the 15th or early 16th century. Alternatively, and I think more likely, he could have used the entirely lost frieze of the Volta Dorata, the beautiful red one which run below the vault, from which the large standing figure there on the top might be a quotation from this frieze. In the perspective of many students of art and literature, the word grotesque evokes suggestion of gloominess, fantasy, mystery, darkness, and the unknown. This is also true for literature, which I leave out today. Still valuable are 5 characteristics listed or worked out by Philippe Morel already in the 1990s. First, he points at the carnavalesque, implying scatological and sexual allusions. Furthermore, he recognizes what he calls macaroni, or deviations from the classical ornamentations. He sees parodies, explosions of madness, and cases of paradox in the Mischwesen, in the mixed figures. All are retraceable, for instance, in this vault of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. In theoretical debates from contemporary Piero Ligorio and Giovanni Paolo Lomazzo to modern scholars just as Bakhtin, Francis Connolly, and most recently Scott Weiss, questions rise about the threatening or buffonesque character of the grotesques. Are they an appropriate decor, for example, for a church or for a palace? Indeed, when we see the grotesques in full light, like here on the screen, they maintain some awkwardness as being incomprehensibly difficult to describe and to define, mixing impossible motifs with recognizable items, both in antiquity and in the Renaissance. They share this fate with similar decorative motifs called after their presumed origins: arabesque, turquerie, chinoiserie, and rocaille. Whereas these trends do not evoke, I think, sinister feelings, the grotesques apparently could not naively serve as pure diverting ornaments only, but due to their hybridity, conveyed more serious messages. The mentioned ornamental fashions were popular, these ones, in the 18th century, when grotesques merged with the new trends after a century of neglection. The latter perhaps due to the Counter-Reformation, when these motifs were since contra naturam. So in art they disappear at the end of the 16th century. In the 18th century publications, the newly discovered paintings in Herculaneum and Pompeii are also called arabesque and chinoiserie. And that happens at the same time when there is a renewed interest in the Golden House Pavilion. Giuseppe Carletti, an abate and a sort of art historian, and the art dealer Ludovico Mirri had got a papal permission to clean rooms of the pavilion, to make drawings and watercolors of the decorations, and the results were both as prints and in book form sold to wealthy travelers. In Carletti's text accompanying the plates, the word grotesca appears 4 times, plus 1 time grotescamente, whilst we find 17 times arabesco, and variations thereof to describe the fantasy motives. Bizzarreria and bizzarramente are other words he uses to describe the ornaments. Looking at the rooms of the Golden House Pavilion known to the Renaissance artists, we see 3 nuclei of rooms the artist had access to, here colored in bright yellow. One concerns for us at the left-hand side the group of monochrome painted rooms we already saw, the yellow and the red room, in the western aisle, followed by the Volta Dorata, that's in the middle of the courtyard, and 3 corridors at the rear of the building, and finally the so-called Volta degli Stucchi at the right-hand side, accessed through the empty room 126. So in total they knew 15 rooms out of more or less 140 rooms we nowadays know of this building. Some more finds were made in the 17th century, and whilst Mirri and Carletti around 1770 opened 21 more rooms, mainly in the western aisle and around the Volta Dorata. That's the green rooms on the. In those days, finally, so in the days of Mirri and Carletti, large parts of the walls were brought to light, so they cleaned the room, so to say, so that the visitors and the readers of their books and of the French copy by Nicolas Ponce gained a better image of the painted wall decorations, and the authors did well in hypothesizing the marble veneer dados, as you see here, even if they had no knowledge of their complete height and did not find traces either. What made the discovery of the grottos and the grotesques so welcome at the end of the 15th century was the fact that painters came in contact with the art of painting of classical antiquity. We saw the name of Apelles among the painters in the poetry, in the poem. The era invoked since decades as a source of intellectual, moral, and artistic inspiration. Renaissance artists envisaged an art all'antica, in the fashion of the ancients, in the fashion of the ancients. Therefore, the discovery occurred in an ideal moment, you can say. The modern artist welcomed the impulses from a much desired world. Giovanni da Udine and Raphael were the great protagonists in Rome, especially with the loggia in the Vatican Palace for Pope Leo X. Their mastery was put into relief by Carletti in the introduction to his Golden House book of 1777. And likewise, George Turnbull had given a positive opinion in a treatise on ancient painting, a very important book in 1740. Coincidentally, Miri and Carletti published their work briefly after the edition of the Loggia by Giovanni Volpato from 1774. So we see a concentration of this interest in that time, and in the same time, a rise of interest in tandem with the discoveries made in the cities buried by Vesuvius, published simultaneously in the Antiquità di Ercolano. And for example, here the architectural fragment was called a chinoiserie. Raphael's decorations of the Loggetta of Cardinal Bibbiena is the prime example of the adaptation of grotesques in a complete decorative system, and differs for that reason from earlier and later uses of the motifs starting in the 1480s. In many cases, we see limitations towards vertical bands, maybe similar to candelabra, by the way, a popular topic in Flavian and later painting as well. And Raphael Giovanni, as we saw, filled the entire surfaces of walls with the connected and intertwined grotesques, whereas just as in the Golden House, figural scenes are relatively modest. The loggia's syntax reflects the corridor 92 in the Golden House. One might suggest that the two of them already perfectly understood what the Neronian fashion entailed. And let me try to explain this a little bit further. When we cast a look on the preserved decorations in the pavilion on the Oppian Hill, next to those known from old drawings, watercolors and print, we see that they constitute a sort of wallpaper concept aiming at pleasing the eye. Architectural schemes, panel decorations and repetitive patterns occupy walls and vaults alike. There are no austere programmatic political associations referring to the emperor, to Nero, to his official qualities, neither in the figural motifs embellishing these schemes, nor in the form of figural panels. If they convey a message, it's that of abundance, a Dionysian bounty strewn over the guests in the pavilion, and sometimes a literary touch like stories from Homer in the Volta di Achille. Not knowing the official residential parts of the Golden House on the Palatine, all demolished under the Domus Flavia, we remain in the dark about specific content, if any, of these decorations. Not any ancient author tells anything about the palatial decorations, unless about the painter Famulus and some single detail. The few remains of the predecessor of the Golden House on the Palatine, the Domus Transitoria, you can now visit on the Palatine, discovered in the early 18th century, do look decorative and festive rather than serious either. Besides the marble veneer that is entirely missing, which formed the essential part of the decoration, the murals and the vaults contain semi-precious stones. That is for example, here, the blue bead there in the right-hand side lower slide. Grotesques form the frame of the figural scenes of some rooms and can be found in other rooms as well, as we can also see on the maquette made by Alix Barbet. In the Renaissance, the lack of naturalism and the endless fantasy adopted in the grotesque decorations was judged negatively for their distance from reality. We saw it already, contra naturam. The critics refer to two testimonies from the time of Augustus, also not from the time of Nero. Around 20 BCE, Vitruvius criticizes the new trends in painting for their increasing use of motifs that have no association with reality. You see, he speaks about monsters, monstra now painted, and reeds are set up in place of columns as pediments, and little scrolls striped with curly leaves and volutes. Candelabra, we already saw in the Sodoma painting, instead of ediculi, etc., etc. Now these things do not exist, he says. So it cannot exist, and then it's not good that we have them. The same change of the art, which is the implementation of unrealistic figures, is observed by the poet Horace at the beginning of his Ars Poetica, published around 19 or 12 BCE. And here you see, if a painter chose to join a human head to the neck of a horse and to spread feathers of many a hue over limbs picked up now here, now there, so that what at the top is a lovely woman and below is a black and ugly fish, could you, if favored with a private view, refrain from laughing? Horace warns for what we might call creative excesses, whereas at the same time, unlike Vitruvius, I think, he does not want to forbid artists to use their fantasy. And indeed, in the 40-30s BCE, we have examples of, so to say, unrealistic motifs in mural decorations which could have inspired the Renaissance painters if they had known them. Gilbert Charles Picard and Elena Walter Caridi have pointed at this start in the 1980s, but also observe a stop around 15 BCE, and we may even lower that date to the 25 or 30 BCE. Walter Caridi states, for example, that the grotesques were not born as framing ornaments, but as independent forms, as becomes clear from the ceilings and floral decorations of that time, like these ones. And she said, quote, if the connection of the organic does no longer reign and the principle of the static loses its power, this implies morphologically the end of the Greek art. The birth of the grotesque ornament, therefore, is a critical shape, a phenomenon that marks the separation between the Greek and the Roman in morphological and epochal sense, not in ethnical sense, end quote. So very dramatic, in fact, she makes it. This sounds very much like the fulfillment of a planned change, full of ideology, but I think the changes did not last very long and remained rather limited. What is more nowadays, what we know now is that these examples decorated in the 40s, 30s, so that Vitruvius and Horace write 20 years after, in fact, the creation of these paintings. The reason the painters had to take distance from the straitjacket of the faint realism with its accentuation of imitation of materials, architectural elements and objects is hidden behind their work. But we may try to give some reasons in a want of free art making, if that ever existed. The changing world in the time of Augustus, in the early days of Augustus, with a lesser degree of importance in politicis of the old societal elite, bereft them from their reason to present their residences as Hellenistic palaces or palace-like dwellings. We see it also in Pompeii, and made them, these houses, more real intimate homes. Otium got more space and constituted new ways of representation. And we might hit the mark if we suggest a stronger freedom in the private realm for the artist. The notion of Venustas, grace, changed over time and entailed a freer view on the old mimesis of real and realistic things which Vitruvius advocated. And we see it here in two vault decorations, which might again have stimulated the Renaissance artists if known to them. The vault of the so-called studiolo of the so-called House of Augustus, and the vault of the Aula Isiaca, both on the Palatine. You see, they contain quasi-vegetal garlands, candelabra, and hybrids human and animal figures in complex compositions without showing a rigorous iconographic program. It's clear that gravitas and stability were not the message expressed by scrolls and other vegetal elements so well known from contemporary marble furniture or from the Arapacis Auguste scrolls some 20 years later. In the 16th century, we observed hot debates on the grotesque paintings in contemporary sources on the basis of the two classical sources we saw. Opinions varied from positive to negative. Positive, the artistic strength stirred fantasia. The modern artist needed a great deal of imagination to combine real with fantastic things and had to be courageous and daring. A work of art could be embellished with grotesque, just as rhetoric disposed of figurae to embellish speech. They were a part of the artist's license to create new things, again, of their fantasia and invenzione, notions we find in Sebastiano Cerlio and in Giorgio Vasari's publications. Il Sodoma, the painter we saw already, saw them as marvels of the East. These creatures live on the edges of our planet. But there's also criticism. One of the widely read authors with a negative response is Daniele Barbaro, who engages into the discussion in his 1556 translation of Vitruvius into Italian and agrees with this author. According to him, grotesques stand outside our order, and their fortune, so to say, is that they are dreams of new worlds. And he concludes, quote, I quote it in English, not in the Latin form, quote, we can really argue that from that genre of painting is born what we can correctly call the dream of a painting, end quote, so not a real painting. His predecessor, translator Cesariano, had a similar opinion in 1521. And the famous Benvenuto Cellini sees the grotesques as monstra, just as Vitruvius did. We also encounter Francisco de Holanda, the man of this beautiful watercolor, who interviewing Michelangelo. He has 8 dialogues with Michelangelo. The Portuguese artist made this important documentation, and in one of the dialogues with Michelangelo, Michelangelo argues that Horace stimulates the artist to make the grotesques, and that they indeed are free to do so. Even if something does not exist, it exists in the hand of the painter. But where, the Hollander asks, where can they apply grotesque? I think not in a church. No, Michelangelo said you can use them everywhere, if done well. However, these forms, criticized by Vitruvius and Horace, and seen in some late Republican, early Imperial decors, form integral parts, as we've seen, of decorative systems, just like columns, architrave, etc. They are not the grotesques we find first in Nero's Domus Aurea, and Domus Transitoria, and later in the Domus Aurea on the Esquiline. So they are different from the Neronian paintings, nor do those in the Renaissance repertoire. So the earlier ones are expression of the fashion of the second half of the third quarter of the first century, and ours, so to say, are in the so-called fourth style in the time of Nero and the Flavians. The Neronian cases provide a different set of motifs and constitute a more systematic entity of decorations of ceilings and vaults, as well as upper zones of mural decorations. So you cannot use the text of Vitruvius and Horace to criticize this material. It is another sort of painting. You see the mix of vegetal, animalesque, human, ornamental elements in a bricolage ad libitum, in which the joy of fantasy and freedom to invent new creatures is at stake. The so-called broidery frames or bordure ajourée, as French colleagues call them, in Corridor 92 form a popular shape of framing panels in the fourth style, but also in the Renaissance. Mix of griffins, pegasi, sphinxes, crabs, dolphins, and psyche with vegetal legs, and the inclusion of Egyptian figures, not quoted, by the way, by the Renaissance artists, resulted Edonius for the new usage. In the fourth style, there does not seem to exist an underlying system apart from the composition of these elements in repetitive bands, serving as frames of cassettes in the vaults or large fields on the walls. Seeking for the cultural mentality of Nero's age, we may refer to what Domenico Esposito recently writes, to observe a tendency to make the private sphere a locus of pleasure and luxury in which the freedom of expression in the arts and the lack of rigid systems reign the decorative arts. The Golden House Pavilion on the Oppius is the most excellent example of that, since here, in the private context, the emperor was looking for pleasure and comfort out of the duties he had to fulfill in public. Last year, Scott Weiss has made clear that the grotesques as a motif exist both in literature and arts of the Neronian era, but also before and after. The emperor was, of course, not responsible for this trend, but it was more determined by the zeitgeist. Weiss hoped to show that, quote, Neronian art and literature could achieve similar effects and took related steps in pursuit of a common goal to expand the parameters of representation, end quote. In Weiss' vision, the study of the grotesques circles around the tension between fantasy and reality, as well as hybridity and ornaments. All three manifest in both literature and art of the Neronian age. So Weiss has argued that animals are references to the outlandish animals Nero staged in his amphitheatrical games. And in his large monograph on Nero of 2025, for this year, Eric Warner notes a link between the birds in the decor of Cryptoporticus 92, that is and the only original verse of Nero that has survived, which runs, "The animated neck of Venus dove is shining." That's all we know from Nero's poetry. It is a good thing that both Weiss and Warner expand the research of the paintings to other contemporary trends in art and literature. But certainly we may detect some correspondences, but that does not mean, I think, that arts and text works run parallel to each other or mutually explain their contents. We know critical remarks Pliny makes on the decrease, so the sinking of the level of painting under Nero at the costs of the increasing use of marble in Tarsia and Opus Sectile, just as the specimens we know from the Domus Transitoria. But this is, of course, a criticism of the usual suspects who painted the blackest possible image of Nero after his death. And I fear that the single line Nero left us does not specifically hint at visual culture, let alone at an imagination as embodied by the paintings in the Golden House. So I'm not that convinced that these texts help us to understand the frescoes itself. Just as the elite of the early empire, the emperor could divide his life, as we have seen already, in an official and a free domain, negotium and otium. And in the complex of his Golden House, Nero created the perfect culmination of this division between the office and free time. Roughly said, the Palatine housed the official domain, the Oppius has preserved the free time quarters, and that's the only building we have now. We see beginnings in Nero's Domus Transitoria, already shown, which, like the pavilion on the Oppius, does not show any austerity. The preserved part is a specus aestivus, a sort of summer grotto, a luxurious, intimate, subterraneous set of rooms, dining rooms for a small group of guests. The vault decorations contain festive panels with garlands, in which the hybrid creatures abound. Colors used are modest, but the elements have been painted with great skill. And I see a certain affinity with the Volta di Achille and the Volta degli Stucchi on the Oppius, in the Domus Aurea, but we cannot say for sure whether the same painters were working in both complexes. For the Renaissance discoverers, this articulation of the Golden House was of course an unknown world to be explored in a complicated way, and offered in an awkward and dark context, as we have seen in the Grotte. They did not know where they were, although Raphael and Francisco de Holanda refer to Domus Aurea Neronis. Later explorers would speak on the Bagni di Tito. In that case, they associated the building with the few remains of a bath building explored by Palladio, of which nothing remains. The Renaissance artists got access to the complete repertoire of paintings systems in the Domus Aurea pavilion on the Oppius. That is, they met with decoration systems of all three workshops active in the building, and all in relation to the four classes of decoration you see here, that is from rich and important rooms to simple and humble. The Volta di Achille, for example, is the product of workshop A, with a wide background and application of stucco relief, and belongs to the second highest category. You see marble veneer on the walls up to 6-7 meters. Cheap alternatives by the same workshop we have seen already are the corridors 92 at the backside, which has provided such a lot of inspiration to the Renaissance painters. And in fact, it was a connection for the personnel of the emperor who had access to the important rooms at the front side. In the hierarchy of Nero's Golden House, of course, its status is low. Nevertheless, the decorations are very highly fantastic and ornamentally rich, albeit painted with a limited color palette and with cheap pigments on a white background. The Volta Dorata is the masterpiece, I think, of the building, the highest prize degree made by workshop B, applying a rich color palette on a colored background and including stucco reliefs and frames. And you see that the marble went up to the beginning of the vault. Here, maybe, Famulus, known from Pliny, might have painted the entirely lost frieze just under the vault we already saw. The monochrome rooms in the western part, the Volta Gialla, the Volta Rossa, Volta Nera, and here the Volta delle Civette, are representative for the third workshop, C, and become here also class R. You see also the marble went up to the beginning of the vault. They offer fine examples of Neronian grotesque decorations attributed to this workshop C, just as the first class Volta delle Civette. This room is called so because of the presence of owls in the friezes, the pets of Minerva. That has a set of heavy registers in a centripetal construction. The owls, small figures, acumen and ornaments depart from vegetal motifs and express the idea of grotesques in a perfect way, I mean for the Renaissance persons. And that's not that much the case in those monochrome rooms we see here. The material of the Golden House, therefore, certainly served as a source of inspiration, and imitatio was an item on the artist's agenda. As Michael Spivey has suggested, the fantastic motifs challenged the Renaissance artist to explore what he calls, quotation, the boundaries between the figurable and the non-figurable, end quote. As the ancients, the Renaissance artists sought for emulatio after imitatio by enriching the original motifs in a way that the Neronian grotesques were barely recognizable any longer. The artists were not aware of their superiority, maybe, in respect to the ancient craftsman. The difficult access and bad visibility of the ancient paintings enhanced their importance, and the Renaissance artists had to conquer the space, you might say, to bring order in the chaos of subtle and gross motifs they saw while lying on their backs or kneeling in uncomfortable positions to copy the paintings. Can we also see grotesques in other Neronian paintings in Rome and in the Vesuvian cities? Since ancient vault and ceiling decorations dating to the time of Nero are rarely preserved in a satisfying way in Rome, we have not many comparable cases matching the Golden House. One more reason, you might say, to congratulate the artists from the Renaissance to find just this building with all this richness. A fine contemporary or slightly later example is the vault of the so-called Pythagogium of the Via dei Cerchi, now preserved in the Antiquarium on the Palatine. Here in a vault decoration found in an unknown context not far from the southern flank of the Palatine, we see part of a surface articulated into cassettes, embellished with fine garlands and bands, peopled with vegetized griffins and other motifs. Too little remains to appreciate the ancient splendor in its full scope, but the dark red ornaments correspond to which we might call grotesque. The mural of the Casa Bellezza on the Aventine have been variously dated, mostly to the Neronian or Flavian age, and the monochrome recalls us to the Yellow Room in the Golden House. The vault is decorated with a repetitive pattern of circles, but unfortunately we have little ornaments to attribute to the grotesque genre, that's detail on the right-hand side. Finally, I show you a vault or ceiling, one of the many lost monuments, in this case probably a room in a domus found near the Via Urbana and documented by Pietro Santabartoli in the 17th century. The center is occupied by a closed velum attached to an octagonal frame, and bands and cassettes surround this motif, and all sections are still filled with fantastic motifs as well as garlands and people's scrolls. And these decorations might be a little bit later, but possibly also be a comparison. We may conclude at this point that the decorations of the Golden House discovered in the Renaissance are the best dossier of the fourth style decorations in Rome, a fashion started in the time of Claudius and fully developed under Nero, being a hybrid of previous trends, but immediately recognizable thanks to compositional schemes and details. So it is the best case. And finally, we may cast a look on the Vesuvian cities for contemporary material that could have inspired the Renaissance artists if they had found it in their time. A couple of cases I want to show. Especially the composition and mixed technique of painting and stucco relief might have stirred Renaissance imagination if they would have seen the fantastic vault of the large Equus A in the Villa Imperiale. The combination of white stucco and black painted background resembles, in a reversed color scheme, the decorations of the Volta di Achille, which you've seen before. Its high quality, which you see also on the left, its high quality has been noted in various publications, and Umberto Pappalardo dates the ensemble into the early Neronian era before the earthquake of 62, so in the time of Nero, after which date the house fell in disrepair. The cassettes are surrounded by stucco frames, maybe without real grotesques, but small fields containing various fantastic and mythical figures aptly fit the idea maybe of the notions of the grotesques. Pappalardo connects this vault with the ceilings in a couple of luxuriously decorated rooms in the rear of the house of Julius Polybius. They probably also partly date to the Neronian era, as has been made clear by Domenico Esposito. In room G, GG has, as you see, a tripartite, you can see on the right maybe, a lowered vault in which a complex subdivision into cassettes can be seen. The central part has a circle filled with a green lozenge, as we have seen in the plate of Pietro Santa Bartoli. And there a Pegasus is flying, whereas other fields accommodate seahorses and birds standing on golden candelabra. The ceiling of the adjacent room, this is now HH, has a less complicated centripetal composition, again with a tondo in the center, and here with the head of Medusa, mounted on a nebris, on a skin of an animal. The broideries are richer and show grotesque elements, such as the sphinxes amidst floral motifs and festoons studded with theatrical masks. My third example is a set of 6 rooms in the Villa Oplontis, which with remains of ceilings applied in the 60s. If the connection made with Nero's wife Poppaea is correct, this is a fine candidate. Exposito connects parts of the decoration with the house of Julius Polybius just discussed as the work of the Vettii workshop. We distinguish ceilings on a red and on a white ground, all consisting of linear composition of friezes around central panels. And these central panels contain miniature representations of fantastic creatures. Grotesques, however, are rare. The candelabra and crowns in the niche of the former Tepidarium 8 form a good candidate. The women in the lateral edicula, the left and the right-hand side, and the still lifes under their feet add figural elements that might reappear in modern grotesques as well. It is a complicated case since part of this decoration is much older. The walls are older, as you see there on top. And maybe the ceiling belongs to the restoration of the 40s or early 50s, before 62. A similar set of details embellishes a red room, 38, a nice sojourn near the southern peristyle of the building. Here we see garlands, broideries, miniature living creatures, and gemstone evocation. Gemstones you also see in the Golden House, next to craters, bucrania, and candelabra. And in corridor 46, there are square compartments subdividing the long space. And in one of them, there is the familiar motif of the oculus, filled with a fantastic creature, whilst the squares of the surrounding frame contain other animals. Garlands circle around the center and fill the outer oblong windows, or panels. Yet we do not recognize anything of the variated repertoire of the Golden House itself, despite maybe the relation with Poppaea. So I come to the conclusion. Maria Fabricius Hansen is explicit in her use of the term grotesques as a phenomenon of the Renaissance, important ornaments characterized by their hybridity and monstrosity. The antique grotesques, if we still may use the word, but I agree with her that we might not maybe speak of ancient grotesques. The ancient grotesque lack many of the explicit elements which have frightened many onlookers and students, made them afraid of the grotesque, or stimulated the artists to go far beyond what was deemed appropriate and fitting decorum. Ancient grotesques are quite ironic and simple deviations of a realistic naturalism, and the old and new grotesques seem only to share the fantastic combination of membra of different creatures and different atmospheres. Not to say that the ancients were only witty and merry people, not at all, but grotesques form part of a Dionysian world, evoked in palaces and houses as expressions of otium. And maybe they testify to the greed of hedonism and the luxuria seen by Pliny and others in the mid-1st century, if we want to take in account, indeed, ancient criticism. The Renaissance grotesques start in a similar way as evocations of ancient vault decorations and develop their own languages and contents. This might be humorous as well as serious, morbid and bizarre, and further developments in the run of the time will bring us far away from these original interpretations and belong to new phases in which antiquity does no longer play a role. I thank you for your attention.